In early 1979, a plane was preparing to land in Tehran. On board was a man who had spent years in exile. He had no army, no official position, and no control over any institution inside the country he was about to enter. And yet, millions were already waiting for him. If he stayed away, he might survive, just another voice speaking from a distance. But if he returned, everything could end the moment he stepped off that plane. There were still forces loyal to the old system. There were still people who saw him as a threat that had to be stopped before it was too late. Around him, the country was already unstable. Protests had shaken the streets. The government was losing its grip. But nothing had been decided yet. And now, everything seemed to depend on one choice. Not a military command, not a declaration of war, just a decision to come back. Because once that decision was made, there would be no way to control what followed. Follow the channel and let's go back to the moment when Ruhollah Khomeini stood on the edge of a decision that would change Iran forever.
By the late 1970s, Iran appeared to be a country moving rapidly toward modernization. Under the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the nation had undergone sweeping changes. Cities expanded, industries grew, and the government pushed aggressively toward Western-style development. Oil revenues fueled ambitious projects, and for many observers outside the country, Iran looked like a rising power in the region. But beneath that image, a very different reality was taking shape. Economic growth had not been evenly shared. While parts of society benefited, many others felt left behind. Inflation and rising living costs placed pressure on ordinary people, and the gap between wealth and poverty became increasingly visible. At the same time, political space was tightly controlled. Opposition voices were limited, and dissent was often suppressed. For some, stability came at the cost of being heard. And perhaps most importantly, the direction of change itself became a source of tension. As the country moved closer to Western influence, many began to feel that something essential was being lost. Cultural identity, religious traditions, and long-standing social structures were being pushed aside in the name of modernization. It was within this environment that a different voice, far from Iran, continued to gain attention. From exile, Ruhollah Khomeini spoke not as a political leader with formal authority, but as a figure who represented an alternative vision. His messages spread quietly at first, then more widely, carried through networks that the government could not fully control. By 1978, protests had begun to grow. What started as scattered demonstrations gradually turned into something much larger. Strikes disrupted key sectors, public gatherings became more frequent, and the sense that the system was beginning to lose control became harder to ignore. But even then, the outcome was far from certain. The government still existed, the institutions were still in place, and no one could say for sure whether the movement would succeed or collapse under pressure. But behind the scenes, a far more dangerous question was beginning to take shape. What would happen if the man in exile decided to return?
In early 1979, Ruhollah Khomeini made his decision. He would return to Iran. At that moment, the outcome was still uncertain. The existing system had not fully collapsed, and there were still forces capable of stopping him. The risk was real. He could be blocked, detained, or removed from the equation before ever reaching the people who were waiting for him. Around him, opinions were divided. Some believed the situation inside Iran was too unstable, too unpredictable. Waiting might have been safer. Others argued that the momentum on the ground might not last forever, and that delay could mean losing the opportunity entirely. There was no guarantee of success, no clear path to power, only a narrow window, and a decision that could not be undone. And once that choice was made, events began to move faster than anyone could fully control.
On February 1, 1979,
the plane touched down in Tehran. What followed was unlike anything the country had seen in years. As Ruhollah Khomeini stepped off the aircraft, the scale of the moment became immediately clear. Vast crowds had gathered, filling roads, rooftops, and open spaces, stretching far beyond what any single authority could organize or control. This was no longer just a return, it was a shift in momentum. Within hours, his presence began to reshape the balance inside the country. Messages were delivered, statements were made, and new lines of authority started to emerge, informal at first, but rapidly gaining recognition among those who had already turned against the existing system. But behind the scenes, the situation remained fragile. Institutions tied to the old order still existed. Armed forces had not fully committed to either side. And for a brief moment, there was still the possibility that events could reverse, that control might be reasserted, or that the surge of public support could begin to fade. Instead, the opposite happened. Each passing day seemed to strengthen the momentum that had been building for months. Government structures struggled to function as before. Loyalty inside key organizations became uncertain. Orders were questioned, responses slowed. And in that uncertainty, a different kind of authority began to take hold. It did not come from official titles or formal power, but from recognition. Millions of people treating one figure as the center of a new direction for the country. Statements issued in his name carried weight. Decisions made around him began to influence actions on the ground. What had once been a voice from outside the country was now shaping events from within it. The transition was not marked by a single moment, but by a rapid sequence of shifts, each one making it harder for the old system to regain control. Within a matter of days, the balance had tipped, and what had started as a decision to return was becoming something far larger.
In the days that followed, the situation inside Iran shifted rapidly. Structures that had once defined authority began to lose their ability to function. Orders were no longer consistently followed, and the chain of command that had held the system together started to weaken from within. What had seemed stable only weeks earlier now appeared increasingly uncertain. For Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the position had already become untenable. Having left the country shortly before these events, his absence only accelerated the collapse of the system he had led for decades. Inside Iran, a new direction was beginning to take form. Figures aligned with Ruhollah Khomeini moved quickly to establish an alternative structure of authority. It did not emerge overnight, but it advanced fast enough to fill the vacuum that was forming. Decisions were made, appointments were announced, and a new political framework began to replace what had existed before. But the transition was not smooth. Uncertainty remained across multiple levels of society. Different groups had different expectations about what the future would look like. Some saw this as a moment of renewal. Others were unsure of what would come next. Economic activity was disrupted. Key sectors slowed or stopped entirely. Daily life became less predictable as institutions adjusted to the changing reality. And beyond the country's borders, the reaction was immediate. Governments around the world watched closely, trying to understand what this shift would mean. Alliances that had once seemed stable were now uncertain. The direction Iran would take, politically, economically, and strategically, was no longer clear. What was clear, however, was that the previous system was no longer in control. History had begun to move in a new direction, and the full consequences of that change were only just beginning to unfold. In the years that followed, the effects of that decision extended far beyond the events of 1979. Iran did not simply change leadership, it changed its entire system. A new form of government took shape, one in which political authority and religious leadership became closely connected. This was not just an adjustment to existing structures, but the creation of a different framework for how power would be defined and exercised. For many inside the country, this shift brought a sense of direction that had been missing. The new system aimed to reflect values that had felt overlooked during the previous period. Certain groups, particularly those who had felt excluded before, now saw themselves represented in ways they had not been. But the transition also came with significant challenges. Economic conditions remained unstable for extended periods. External pressures increased, and Iran entered a long and costly conflict with Iraq shortly after the revolution. That conflict placed further strain on resources and shaped the country's development for years to come. At the same time, Iran's relationship with much of the international community became more complicated. Tensions with Western nations intensified, leading to periods of isolation that affected trade, investment, and long-term economic growth. Inside the country, social and cultural life also changed in lasting ways. New regulations and expectations reshaped public life. For some, these changes provided structure and clarity. For others, they introduced limitations that had not existed before. The balance between collective identity and individual freedom became an ongoing point of tension, one that would continue to evolve over time. Decades later, the consequences of that moment are still visible. Iran remains a country shaped by that decision, its political system, its global position, and many aspects of daily life, all reflecting choices made during that period. And this is where the complexity becomes clear, because the decision to return did not simply resolve the pressures that existed before, it redirected them. It replaced one set of challenges with another, and set Iran on a path that continues to be debated to this day.
Looking back, the decision by Ruhollah Khomeini to return to Iran in 1979 stands as one of the most consequential turning points in the country's modern history. It was not a decision made in a vacuum. It came at a time when pressure had already been building, when the existing system was under strain, and when multiple outcomes were still possible. In that context, his return did something critical. It accelerated everything. It transformed a fragile situation into a decisive shift, pushing events beyond the point where they could be reversed. From a historical perspective, this was neither a simple success nor a clear failure. It resolved certain tensions that had been growing for years, but at the same time, it introduced new challenges, political, economic, and social, that would shape Iran for decades. And that is what makes this decision so significant, because it did not just change what happened next, it changed the direction entirely. So the question remains, if Khomeini had chosen not to return to Iran in 1979, would the country today be fundamentally different? Or would history have found another way to reach the same outcome?